passage, and then we'll explain what it means a little bit later on here. 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, the Apostle Paul tells us, beginning in verse 12, he says, "Now wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall. There hath no temptation taking you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able to bear, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape, that ye may be able to bear it." You know, several years back, on the notes you have on the back of it, there's a poem that I wrote. And as you read it, you will be amazed that I will admit I wrote it, because I'm not much of a poet. But it is one of several. I from time to time just sit down and try to write poetry. It doesn't always turn out well, but it's beneficial to me just to put down thoughts in different ways. And this one was Living in the Shadow. And sometime if you're at my house, you can look, and one special lady, Linda Essex, did I think it's called a cross stitch. So she took it and put it on a frame and put a cross on there and has this poem on there. And so I get to see it at various times whenever we've got hanging in various places. But the poem goes, "When sin seems so pleasant and my will such a loss, please lead me, dear Father, to the shadow of the cross. When my strength I feel can carry me in the way, Father, lead me to the cross, and in its shadow help me stay. When the trials of life seem so heavy, the burdens too hard to bear, Father, lead me to the shadow, that I may see who hangs there. Father, may my eyes be open to the one who set me free. May I live always in the shadow of the cross he bore for me." I've had people ask me before, whenever they've seen that poem, and I put it in the bulletin at different times and such, and they said, "Well, why did you write that?" And I tell people that I use the three-finger rule. And then people say, "What is the three-finger rule?" And I think you know what it is. Some people think that whenever I preach, or anybody preaches, teaches a class and such, that they're always saying you. The three-finger rule is, I can point at you, but I got three fingers pointing back at me. And so whenever I write poetry or I write a lesson, I'm kind of selfish. I do it for me. And I believe 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, first of all of us need to take heed. We need to watch after ourselves. And if you watch a devotional tomorrow, you'll find a man who doesn't have much hair. But I think you can recognize him, even though he's got longer and curly hair now. But he's going to have a lesson on facing stress and facing such things, anxiety. And one of the emphasis in it is not only what the Lord does, but what we do for each other. So in other words, we do look at each other, but we also look to ourselves and expect others to look at us. And that's what this poem is about. It's things that all of us face. We have to be aware of ourselves, our failings, the temptations, the trials, and the hopes that are before us. And so this poem set that forth, so I thought I would just take the time to look at it and point out when, in my mind, we need the shadow of the cross. Now, by that I mean, go to Calvary. We, each first day of the week, come together and we take the Lord's Supper in remembrance of Him, the sacrifice that He made, the blood that was shed, His body that was given for the remission of sins. And whenever you think about Him hanging on that cross, I hope that it has a special meaning, a special emphasis, and a special motivation in all of our lives. And I know it does in mine. I believe it does in yours too. So in this poem, we have three different occasions in which I need, and I believe you too need, the shadow of the cross. The first is when sin seems so pleasant, and my will such a loss. You look at that and you think about 1 John the 2nd chapter, and I mentioned that this morning. Sin's fun. Sin fulfills my desires. You know, we sadly, as we grow, we become acclimated to the world. We fight against it maybe, but we still become as the world in many senses. We're not born that way. Don't let anybody ever tell you that. We are born pure and free from sin. But the reality is, we allow sin to creep in. And the reason that we do that, as we spoke of this morning, open the door of sin, is because the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. But John tells us these things are not of the Father. They're of the world. And so I look and I see that, but we battle, don't we? We look, and whenever we're younger, our parents tell us, no, you can't do that. And we look at it, you just don't want me to have fun. You don't want me to have these things. And that's not true. God doesn't want us to have sin in our life. And so he tells us these things are not of the world, but they're there. They're a temptation that are upon us. James talks about the lust is there. We choose to let it conceive. And when we let it conceive is whenever we convince ourselves that I deserve this. I live this good life over here. I don't do this. I don't do this. I'm not a murderer. I'm not this. I'm not that. So this little thing, and I convince myself that that's pleasant and I deserve it. My will is not such a great thing in this instance that I can't fulfill it. And so I don't want to lose it. And I engage in sin. So whenever I have those feelings come upon me, what do? Well, lead me, dear Father, to the shadow of the cross. If you think about the shadow of the cross, you think about the steps leading up to it. Think about Jesus in the garden. Oftentimes do. You know, I like you most likely, I try to avoid things that are painful, that are a loss to me, and I want to do the things that fulfill my desires. But I go back and I picture Jesus as he was heading towards that cross. And I see him saying, Father, if there be any other way, let this cup pass from me. He was tempted in all ways like as you and I, but without sin. The temptation was before him to call the legions of angels, to say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to take this way. I'm going to go away from this. I'm going to take the freedom from pain, the freedom from suffering, and enjoy a little bit myself. But he didn't. And when I stand in the shadow of the cross, I see Jesus with his arms outspread, hanging on that cross, beaten, bleeding, saying, I gave up my will. What will you do? And then it brings the sin that I think is so pleasant, my will, it brings it into a proper perspective. You know, there's songs, and I started to put the songs up, but I didn't know that Robbie had already gotten everything set up long beforehand, or I would have come over and do it. But there's a song we have, and I'm not going to sing it, but you can write it down, and you can go and look at it a little bit later. Number 449, none of self and all of thee. Oh, the bitter pain and sorrow that a time could ever be when I proudly said to Jesus, all of self and none of thee. All of self, none of thee, all of self and none of thee. When I proudly said to Jesus, all of self and none of thee. I mean, the song goes on and it shows, hopefully, the progression that each one of us goes through. That yes, we face that temptation, but then we realize who hangs there. And we say, none of self, all of thee. So I need the shadow of the cross whenever sin does seem pleasant and I think my will is such a loss. But then I need it whenever my strength, I feel, can carry me in the way. Remember the text we read? 1 Corinthians 10:12. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Now, he'd given examples right before that in the verses before of an Old Testament occasion in which many fell. And he says, wherefore, Jack, take heed lest you think you stand. How many times do we think, and this is another step really in accord with the first one, whenever I think, well, Sin's pleasant. It's not so bad, just this one little thing. You see, I've got this mistaken idea that I have the strength. I'm not going to do that. I won't let that. I won't be persuaded. But I'm taking that little step. The writer in Proverbs 28 and verse 26 says, "He that trusteth in himself is a fool." You know, that's it. I realize that, no, I can't face this alone. Sadly, I've faced people that studying and trying to talk with them, they say, well, you know, I got to take care of this first and then I'll go to God. I'm not ready for religion in my life. I got to straighten this out. And I said, well, how can you do that? And the reason I know it doesn't work, because I was a fool for a lot of years. I thought that I could handle things. I could do this. And I found out that I could do nothing. And I think that's what God wants us to see. The very fact that I think my strength can do it is to look at the cross and say, what are you doing there? I didn't need that. Say, I would never say that, but in my life, whenever I reject Christ and I think I can do it myself, that's what I'm doing. The Apostle Paul, in Philippians, the 4th chapter, in verse 13, gives us the truth. I can do all things through Christ. You see, without Him, I'm nothing. Another song we sing, if you want to write it down, number 779. It's without Him I could do nothing. Without Him I'd surely fail. Without Him I'd be drifting like a ship without a sail. Jesus, oh Jesus. Do you know Him today? You can't turn Him away. Oh Jesus, without Him, how lost I would be. Without Him, I would be dying. Without Him, I'd be enslaved. Without Him, life would be hopeless. Without Jesus, thank God, but with Jesus, thank God, I'm saved. You look at that and you think about that life that probably every one of us has lived. The time before we became a child of God. I don't need religion yet. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and then I'll take care of that, and then I'll think about religion. And what we do is we just go deeper in the despair that song speaks of, and the despair that the Bible speaks of. But the very fact that Jesus hangs on that cross says, Jack, you need Him. He didn't hang there as a plan B. He hangs there as the way. Without Him, I, you, the world can do nothing. So I need the shadow of the cross whenever I get that boastful idea, that prideful idea that my strength can carry me in the way. And then thirdly, whenever the trials of life seem heavy, the burdens too hard to bear. You know, I'm assuming all of us have been there. You get there, fingertips give way. You just fall it. Hopeless, helpless. Because there's no way to go through this. There's no way to get this through. There's no way to bear this. How many times do we see, one of the struggles that's faced today? We all face the trouble, the anxiety, the fears, the horrors, the worries at this time during having to deal with this pandemic. But the reality is, that's life. The devil wants us to let fear, despair, hopelessness come over us. But God says you don't have to have that. One of the sad things during this time, and it's not spoken of much, you hear a lot about the deaths due to COVID and such as that. Sometime take a look at the rise in suicide. Sometime take a look at the rise of people who are turning to drugs. Sometime take a look at the people who ended up hospitalized on various medications that help them just cope mentally with everything that's upon them. Why? Because we get to this point of despair. We get like Elijah. hiding in the cave. Nobody cares anymore. I've worked for you, God, and everything's going bad. And so he says, I'm hiding here. You know, I remember whenever my kids were growing up, there's a little song that depicted that. I don't know what all the song ends up going with, but it's, you know, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I'm going to eat some worms. And I mean, that song's a funny little song, but you think about it, and how many times people live that way. Nobody cares. Well, I need to go to the shadow of the cross. I need to remember Jesus said in Matthew the 11th chapter in verse 28 and following, come unto me all you that labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. I mean, you look and you find Jesus says, I'm willing to bear the ultimate burden, that is the penalty of sin for you. But he's also there to help us through life. Whenever the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy 4, he said, all men forsook me. They left him. He was there about to be put to death, and they left him. But he says in verse 17, nevertheless the Lord stood by me. See, we know Jesus is always there. You know, the devotional tomorrow, one of the things about dealing with despair, with stress, is the realization that the God who, when he walked upon this earth, who healed the lame, raised the dead, who had that power, he doesn't use the physical power today, but he uses the spiritual power to give us a hope that transcends, allows us to rise above everything in this world that we think is so hard. And so we then become, as we stand in the shadow of the cross and say, okay, Jesus, you paid that price. You went to the cross so that I can know, so that I can have this hope that's an anchor of the soul. You've given me the ability to rejoice, to live joyfully in the midst of trial. That's one of the amazing things of the first century church. Here's the Apostle Paul in prison in the Philippian letter. And he's writing them and he says, rejoice evermore. How can you say that? Because in 2 Timothy 4, remember he knew the Lord was with him? He says, I'm ready to be offered. Time of my departure is at hand. But what did he know was before him? He said, there's a crown of life that the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give unto me in that day. Then he says, not to me only, but to all of you who love his appearing. I mean, I look to Jesus. I stand in the shadow of the cross and I realize what he's done. And I think about in John 14, whenever he told the disciples, this is going to happen. I'm going to die. But then he said in John 14, he says, I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. We sing that song, The Way of the Cross Leads Home. I don't have to bear that cross. Well, there's a cross that we all bear of sacrificing my will, of avoiding those things that may seem pleasant, but they're not, of going on and using Christ's strength, humbling myself unto him and submitting unto him. There's that cross I bear, but I don't bear the cross that's brought on by sin, because the way of that cross, following him, leads to the home that I know I have. I know that there is that way. Another song, you might write down song number 150. And there, the song is, Follow Me. I traveled down a lonely road, and no one seemed to care. The burden on my weary back had bowed me to despair. I oft complained to Jesus how folks were treating me, and then I heard him say so tenderly, my feet were also weary upon the Calvary road. The cross became so heavy I fell beneath the load. Be faithful, weary pilgrim, the morning I can see. Just lift your cross, follow after me. The song goes on, exemplifying the sacrifice of Jesus, him hanging on the cross, showing me that, yes, he does care. He will help me bear that burden. I'm surrounded by others who are following him, who says, come along, let's go together. I stand in the shadow of the cross. And all of these things that the devil would have to pull me down and take me away from Jesus, I stand in the shadow, and they pale. They go away. So then I look, and I realize these things are common. Other people are facing them, so I lean upon others. But then the last stanza says, Father, may my eyes be always open to the one who set me free. May I live always in the shadow of the cross he bore for me. You see, I realize in my life, when I have the greatest struggles, whenever I have the greatest temptations, it's because I maybe am living on the fringe of that shadow instead of living in it and looking to him. And I think that's the one finger. You have that problem too. I have it a lot. I got 3 fingers. But I read this poem, and I read it oft times, and I realize another song, number 384, lead me to Calvary. I don't ever want to leave there. I'm so thankful we assemble together. My heart breaks that we're not all together. I long for the time whenever fears and sickness and such will not keep us apart. I know ultimately that's heaven itself, but I appreciate so much a taste of heaven on this earth whenever we join together. We share these joys, the anticipations, and we bear the burdens, but we look unto Jesus. Whenever I come together on the first day of the week and I'm able to set my mind back, it's like a recharge, like a reset. Throughout the week, the world, acting with the devil, tries to push me out of that shadow. When I partake of the Lord's Supper, and I do this in remembrance of him, it's a reset. Living in the shadow. A glorious life. It's a life of horror as you look what he did, and a life of joy that you look what he did, why he did, and he did it for me, for you. So I pray, that little poem might help you, but most of all, the verses we look at, the things we sing as we teach and admonish one another, that they might help us to realize the value of living in the shadow, and that we'll always stay there. Tonight, maybe you're like each one of us at times. You've drifted away. Well, Jesus is still there. The blood is still flowing, 1 John 1 and verse 7. He's at the right hand of the Father awaiting us. He's gone and he's prepared that place, and he wants us to be there, but he knows that the only way is through the cross, through that blood that was shed. If you have not become a child of God, you've not yet contacted the blood. You ever notice that he shed his blood in his death? And in Romans, the 6th chapter, we're baptized into his death. I'd submit to you that there's no way you're going to contact the blood outside of Christ. But you can do that as you're baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins. That can be done tonight. If you slipped away, you go back to it. And that blood, that sacrifice, take away that sin. 1 John 1 and verse 9, doesn't matter what sin it is, we repent and he takes us back. But determined that we will live in the shadow of the cross and we'll help and hold each other to keep ourselves in that shadow. We can help you to do that. Let's do it as we stand and sing the song of invitation.